chapter 1, verse 16. Mark.
The descendants of the Kenite, Moses' father-in-law, went up from the city of palms with the sons of Judah to the wilderness of Judah, which is in the south of Arad, and they went and lived with the people.
So an almost parenthetical insert is given here to remind the reader of the long-lasting clan ties between the house of Jethro, Reuel, same name, right? Exodus chapter 2, and the nation of Israel. Long-lasting clan ties. Why? Because Jethro, or Reuel, is the father-in-law of Moses. Apparently, once Judah had penetrated into Judah in the Negev, the Kenites, feeling at home in the region, that was kind of as close to the lay of the land, the landscape, the terrain, as Midian was in the Sinai Peninsula. As close as they could find to in Israel, they settled south of Arad, which you can see on the map, which was, like I mentioned before, the eastern pole of the biblical Negev. And though they're somewhat detached, as you can see from the hills of Judah, they would be a friendly presence. They would be a southeastern, maybe not visible or maybe invisible, nevertheless a southeastern kind of presence and fortification for Judah's southern and Judah's eastern border that would hopefully, then these Canaanites would help the ties by warding off any raiders or any kind of Edomite invasions from the east. Verse 17. Lane.
And Judah went with Simon his brother, and they slew the Canaanites that inhabited Zephath, and utterly destroyed it, and the name of the city was called Hormah.
Okay, thank you. Since there is a multitude of biblical traditions concerning the place name of Hormah, it is very difficult to pinpoint its true location with accuracy. Now, Hormah, it's first mentioned as being a site Israel retreated to when they were fleeing the Amorites. And Amorites probably just means Westerners, probably something like that. So, Deuteronomy 1:44, the Amorites who lived in those hills came out against you. They chased you like a swarm of bees and beat you down from Seir. Seir means hairy, Harrry. And like Esau is hairy, Seir is another name for Edom. Okay? A hairy mountain. And the reason it's called hairy mountain is because from a distance it's just so covered with vegetation that it looks like it's just growing, that there's hair growing on the mountain. All the way to Hormah. Another tradition identifies Hormah as Arad in the Negev. And this is inferred from Numbers 21:3. The Lord listened to Israel's plea and gave them the Canaanites over to them. They completely destroyed them and their council. The place was named Hormah. Well, nevertheless, the city was either a city center, kind of like a Chico or a Reading, a city center, or it was a daughter city in the Negev to southern Judah. And here's a possible location. You can see where the arrow is, right here, of the site of Hormah. Okay? Verse 18. John.
Judah also captured Gaza with its territory, and Ashkelon with its territory, and Ekron with its territory.
Now, according to John Garstang, a name that you might want to be familiar with, a early 20th century archaeologist, it's called a Petrie Pup. William Matthew Flinders Petrie, the father of Egyptology, had some disciples, some students, and he was one of them. Anyways, it's possible, according to him, to date this period in verse 118 to the end of the reign of Akhenaten in Egypt, which would help explain why the tribe of Judah could actually take Gaza. Because apparently, with religious and political and military and economic difficulties in Egypt, the Egyptians were not able to hold on to this route here, the Way of Horus, and therefore they were not able to hold on to the all-important port of Gaza, because throughout almost all of biblical history, Egyptian power, the hand of Egyptian power and influence reached all the way through Sinai to Gaza. The Gaza is almost always, at least until you get to the Iron Age period, right? An Egyptian stronghold. Now, let's continue. The reader senses that Judah was able to take 3 Philistine cities, right? Gaza, Ashkelon, and Ekron. And that there was a strong Philistine presence in the land. Now, since we can date these events likely taking place, if you go with Garstein, according to the end of the reign of Akhenaten, the victory of Ramses III over the Sea peoples has not happened yet. And we can surmise that this is part of the reason why the tribe of Judah was able to take these cities. Judah was able to take these cities because the Philistines had not yet lived in them. They were Canaanite cities, not Philistine cities. The Philistines do not invade the eastern Mediterranean seaboard, and pushed off by Ramses III, you can see a relief right here of him doing that until like the beginning of Iron Age 1, like 1200, somewhere in that time period, probably. Nevertheless, Judah could not contain and could not control these cities that they conquered in verse number 18. At least not for long. Because later, during the time of Samson, later in the book, we see that Ashkelon was what? Back in Philistine control. Back in Philistine control. Verse number 19. Ron.
And the Lord was with Judah, and he drove out the inhabitants of the mountain, but could not drive out the inhabitants of the valley, because they had chariots of iron.
So the main surviving Canaanite strongholds, in Israel, after Judah's military adventures, we see here were in the valley. In the valley. Now, in this context, the valley here should probably be understood as the famous valley of Jezreel. Jezreel literally means where Yahweh sows, like where Yahweh sows seed. Besides flourishing in the north, the Canaanites, the north being Galilee, the Canaanites also had a strong presence on the the Phoenician coastal plain, right here, Akko, Tyre, and up to Sidon. Now, the Israelites had 0 chance of defeating the Canaanites in the valley of Jezreel, and in any other valley for that matter, because, well, first of all, not only are they outmanned, but they're out-armed. The Canaanites have chariots and weapons of war, and the Israelites have 0 chance in an open valley without any kind of tanks. It's like ground soldiers versus tanks, with the chariots versus ground soldiers, and they have no chance, so they have to stay up in Manton and up in Shingletown, and they can't come down from there down to the valley, because this is where the Canaanites are. All right, verse number 20, Mark.
Then they gave Hebron to Caleb, as Moses had promised. And he drove out from there the 3 sons of Anak.
Okay, God, who signified him as, quote unquote, my servant Caleb, he finally inherited his land, which he was promised to him at least 4 different times in the scriptures. One example is here, in Deuteronomy 1:36. except Caleb the son of Jephunneh, he will see it, and I will give him and his descendants the land he set his feet on, because he followed the Lord wholeheartedly. And at least 4 times, like I said in the Torah, Caleb is promised because of his wholeheartedness after God to inherit the land. By far, guys, land and family are the 2 most important aspects in the social fabric of ancient Near Eastern society. Everything is rooted or based in land and family. This, guys, being the last time that Caleb is mentioned alive in the Bible, the reader can now portray him as living out his days, quote unquote, under his own vine and fig tree, and the peace and the safety, prosperity afforded to him by God, which would be what? His home, his land, finally that he inherited, right? He no longer has to live in a tent, which he has to pick up and roll up and move to the next place, put up and pick up and roll to the next place, right? He finally has a house with foundations. Okay, he can spend his days out there. And family. And his family. A note is given at the end of the verse, which also includes the last time Anak or his descendants are mentioned in the Bible. Now, the site of Hebron would, of course, stay within the sway of important cities in the political sphere of Judah for hundreds of years, as, of course, David would utilize the city as his first capital. Verse 21. Verse 20.
The Benjamites, however, did not drive out the Jebusites, who were living in Jerusalem. To this day, the Jebusites live there with the Benjamites.
All right, the Jebusites were the 3rd son of Canaan, the son of Ham. Right? Jebusites, Amorites, and Girgashites. The Jebusites were the 3rd son of Canaan, the son of Ham, who were evidently the main components, these people were the main components of the occupants of what would become Israel in the pre-Davidic, pre-King David era. The Jebusites, they settled in and around the city of Jebus, which means this, a place trodden down. Jebus means a place trodden down, such as a threshing floor, like you can see in the picture. Now, of course, the site would become Jerusalem, as David purchased the same threshing floor from Araunah, the Jebusite. In 2 Samuel 24:18. On that day, Gad went to David and said to him, "Go up and build an altar to the Lord." Where? On the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. An altar to the Lord on the Jebus of Araunah the Jebusite. Now, apparently the short-lived siege and destruction of Jebus by the tribe of Judah, which we read about earlier in the book, the short-lived siege, it did not render Jebus ineffective enough to reclaim and build their capital city. Judges 1:21, where we're at now, through 36, which is the end of the chapter, is a list of the areas where non-Israelites continued to dwell. Let me say that again. Judges 1:21 through verse 36. It's a list. It's a map of the areas or the cities where non-Israelites continued to dwell, continued to live in the land of Canaan. All right, verse number 22. John.
Was that something he was not supposed to do?
Can you say it a different way?
It looks like, I mean, they were driving out all the Canaanites, and it looks like Benjamin went in and didn't drive them out. Was that something that, and you have this commingling of people, was Was God upset at that, or?
Well, exactly. There's a lot of that going on, right? They really don't seem to be at first read like real gung ho about driving everyone out, do they? They seem to kind of be complacent with living next to.
Yeah, there's some parts of the Bible where you would really, you just drive them out, and there's other places where they seem to, you have to get along with each other.
Yeah.
To a certain Daniel and Babylon, they got along.
Sure.
We're
Sure. Good. John.
The house of Joseph also went up against Bethel, and the Lord was with them.
Okay. Like taking Hebron, which we did earlier, taking Bethel gave back to the Israelite clans a city or a site associated with deep-seated ancestral ties, with huge religious associations. Like, we finally were able to reclaim the city where Jacob had his dream. And the quote-unquote ladder, even though it's not a ladder, it's a ramp, right? Went from heaven to earth. That place, we finally took it back. And it's located, you can see right here on the map, Bethel, right on the main ridge, right on Highway 5, right on the watershed ridge. The Israelites up to this point, they now appear to have a firm grip. Israelites have a firm grip on the inner portion of the country. Not on the edges, not on the borders, not on the coast, but on the inner portion of the country. It seems they control the patriarchal highway, the main north-south route, Highway 5. It seems that they control it now. And then also the cities, the sites associated with that route. At this time, the house of Joseph was firmly establishing itself in the high hill country of Judah, and they're attempting, it seems, to push their border northwards. Verse 23. Right. 23.
And the house of Joseph sent to describe Bethel. Now the name of the city before was Luz.
Okay. Setting their eye, the house of Joseph, setting their eye on reclaiming the famous patriarchal site, a company of men from the house of Judah were sent to spy out the city center of Bethel. Now, it is very likely, even though I can't prove it, it's very likely that the altar and the pillar of Jacob were still standing at the site, as many in their world, and even to this day, adhere to that long-standing tradition of the sanctity of a site and not to remove the ancient, or not to remove the landmark which the ancients have set. So it's possible that that altar and that pillar were still standing, because whoever would have come in next would have been superstitious people and would not have destroyed it, right? They would have appropriated it into their own religion, possibly. Now, an editorial note is given to remind the reader of the 6 previous mentions of Luz in the scripture. Now, the name of the city before was Luz. That is to say, remember when we read back in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and Joshua? It was called Luz back then, is what they're saying. Now, the name Luz means almond tree. There you go. In the world of the Bible, the rod of an almond tree, they frequently begin to bloom in January. Okay? So when you're reading, for example, Jeremiah chapter 1, and it's talking about the almond tree blooming, it's probably in the month of January. Okay? And there it is right there. It's very beautiful. Verse number 24. 24.
The spies saw a man coming out of the city, and they said to him, "Please show us the entrance to the city, and we will treat you kindly."
The man coming out of Luz was likely a Hittite, and would likely have been exiting the city from the east. Most walled cities in the world of the Bible, with only one gate, have been found oriented towards the east. Now, there are numerous theories why this is case, most of which are speculation, but we can surmise it has something to do with the rising of the sun, the idea of judgment, something like that. Now, we're looking at here's an image from an Egyptian relief of a Hittite. Verse number 25.
So he showed them, and they put the city to the sword, but spared the man and his whole family.
As we suspected, the city had the entrance, one entrance. In smiting the city with the edge, or the pet, transliterated P-E-H, which can mean not only edge, but extremity or end of the sword. It highlights the total annihilation of the city's inhabitants by the house of Joseph. The reader is reminded that this man and his family, like Rahab and her father's household, were spared because of the fear of the God of Israel, Joshua 6:25. But Joshua spared Rahab. By the way, Rahab's name probably means wide, as in wide load. I don't know. That's just what the name means. Wide. Okay. It's a, I don't know. You can take it whichever way you want. But wide load coming through. Like, okay, Rahab. But that's what her name means. But Joshua spared Rahab the prostitute with her family and all who belonged to her. Why? Because she hid the men of Joshua that had sent as spies to Jericho, and she lives among the Israelites to this day, and I'm sure that this guy did as well. Verse number 26.
And the men went to the land of the Hittites and built a city and called its name Luz. That is its name to this day.
Okay. As we surmise from earlier, because of this verse, that he's a Hittite. Now, the second son of Canaan, here's the region of the Hittites right here. The second son of Canaan was Heth. Okay. He was the progenitor, he was the father of the Neo-Hittite people group. And the Neo-Hittite, the Hittites were a northwest Semitic dialect people and originally settled within the boundaries of the land of Canaan. The boundaries of the land of Canaan are given in Genesis chapter 10, verse 19. And the border of the Canaanites was from Sidon, as thou comest to Gerar, unto Gaza, as thou goest unto Sodom and Gomorrah, all the way to Zeboim. Some have suggested that the modern day site of Luz Wazia in the Golan Heights, which is just 4 miles from Banias, Caesarea Philippi, is to be identified with the newly established city of Luz mentioned in this verse. Others insist that the land of the Hittites should refer to the Orontes Valley or the land further north in the Amanus Range in south-central modern-day Turkey. Nevertheless, he goes from here up to here, builds a city, calls the name of the city the same name, Luz. There's our Hittite friend right here. Verse 27. Verse 27. Right?
Neither did Manasseh drive out the inhabitants of Bethshean and her town, nor Tanakh and her town, nor the inhabitants of Dor, her town, nor the inhabitants of Eblim, her town, nor the inhabitants of Megiddo and her towns, that the Canaanites would dwell in that land.
Okay, so from this verse to the end of the chapter, we got a great and excellent example of a map put to an event a map put to an event. In this particular verse, we have a list of city fortresses located at strategic points in and around the Valley of Jezreel. And these strategic points in and around the Valley of Jezreel prevented the house of Joseph from expanding their kingdom northward from Bethel. These cities that are mentioned in verse number 27 should be understood as Canaanite strongholds who had an abundance of natural resources at their disposal. It's possible that Manasseh could have had a peaceful expansion north of Bethel, and the reason he could have had a possible peaceful expansion north of Bethel is possibly linked to the faint blood relations the Israelites had with those tribes. Maybe. Once again, highlighting the importance of the locations of these sites, we are reminisced to consider that all 5 of these cities mentioned in verse number 27 are also contained in the city list you can see here of Thutmose III. So it's all about location, location, location. And not only that, all of these are also mentioned in the Amarna tablets from the 14th century. Both Bet-Shan and Megiddo, they appear there as Egyptian strongholds in the land of Canaan at this time. Verse number 28, Mark.
It came about when Israel became strong that they put the Canaanites to forced labor, but they did not drive them out completely.
The reference to quote unquote when Israel was strong is probably referring to the time of David and Solomon. Probably referring to the time of the United Monarchy. Like 300 years later. 1 Kings 5, 13 through 18. King Solomon conscripted laborers from all Israel, 30,000 men. He sent them off to Lebanon in shifts of 10,000 a month, so they spent 1 month in Lebanon and 2 months at home. Adoniram was in charge of the forced labor. Solomon had 70,000 carriers and 80,000 stonecutters in the hills, as well as 3,300 foremen who supervised the project and directed the workers, etc., etc., etc. So this verse explains how these newly subjected Canaanites and Hittites were subjected to forced public labor at the beginning of the reign of Solomon. This statement in this verse also helps eliminate the authorship of the book taking place before the beginning of Iron Age 2, before 1000 BC, if indeed when Israel was strong means during the time of the United Monarchy. Okay? Verse number 29.
Nor did Abraham drive out the Canaanites living in Gezer, but the Canaanites continued to live there long.
Gezer, not Gezer.
Gezer.
I know. You said it right. You said it right. Sits atop like a promontory, and it commands this panoramic view of almost like 360 degrees. You can sweep around, you can see the coast, you can see the Sharon Plain, you can see the lowlands, the hill country of Judah, and all the way down to almost Gaza by Ashdod. The site is what you should think of as like the front door into Jerusalem, or the front door into the land of Benjamin. This front door was such a big, bad Canaanite city center that it was never taken by any Israelite until the time of Solomon. And the only reason Solomon could take Gezer was he did it through a political marriage. 1 Kings 9:16 says, Pharaoh, king of Egypt, had attacked and captured Gezer. He set it on fire. He killed its Canaanite inhabitants and then gave it as a wedding gift to his daughter. Solomon's wife. So Ephraim, the tribe of Ephraim, could not drive out the Canaanites that dwelt in Gezer, because Gezer is a big, bad, strong city center on the corner of Highway 80 and Highway 99, and it's just too big. We can't take it. Verse number 30. John.
Zebulun did not drive out the inhabitants of Kitron or the inhabitants of Nahor, so the Canaanites lived among them, but became subject to forced labor.
Kitron, probably means incense, like incense. And this site is totally unknown by geographers. Nahalol, the other city mentioned here, probably means pasture, and it has been suggested by some to be associated with a small village named Malul, which is in the former region of Zebulun. Possibly the tribe of Zebulun drove out the Canaanite enclaves in the higher elevation of the region, but they did not drive out the Canaanite inhabitants in and around the Fertile Valley. Verse 31. Right.
Asher did not drive out the inhabitants of Akko, or the inhabitants of Sidon, or Elam, or of Asib, or of Elipah, or of Aphek, or of Rehob.
Okay, so the majority of these place names are unknown. Nobody knows where they really are. But the identity of the easily identified sites of Akko, as you can see on the map, which is actually Acher on the map, and Sidon, it helps place these cities on the Phoenician seaboard. We know they're in that region, you can see on the map right there. Now, living among the seacoast and in the vicinity of these port cities would have likely exposed these tribes, these Israelites, to the temptations of cultural assimilation, marriage assimilation, and that temptation would have been there more than any of the other Israelite tribes faced. Because you're living like in San Francisco, not Manta. You're not living high up in the hill country like Ephraim and Manasseh is. You're right on the coast, in the thick of it. And it'd be much easier to bend, to assimilate into the religious and the cultural and the intermarriages practices of the peoples that you live amongst there. Verse 32, Mark.
So the Asherites lived among the Canaanites, the inhabitants of the land, for they did not drive them out.
Now, the geopolitical pressure presented from living among the Canaanite groups on the coast who had a strong affinity towards Egypt was probably that overarching reason why Asher was later not able to come to the assistance of Deborah, which we'll see in Judges 5:17. It is therefore possible that the tribe of Asher was reduced to the position of a farmhand, basically. Because unlike the tribe of Zebulun, it does not say that the Canaanites became tributaries. Verse number 33.
Neither did Naphtali drive out those living in Beth Shemesh or Beth Anath, but the Naphtalites to live among the Canaanite inhabitants of the land, and those living in Beth Shemesh and Beth Anath became forced laborers for them.
All right, good job. Now, the sites of Beth Shemesh and Beth Anath have escaped or eluded geographers, but interestingly, the names of the sites should be associated with Canaanite cultic sanctuaries. The house, or Bet Shemesh, is associated with Shemesh, the sun god, as you can see here. And the house of Anak with the Canaanite goddess Anat. Since God no longer seems to be center stage in the book, it is not surprising, but it is still disheartening that the Israelites permitted Canaanite cultic sites to apparently flourish in their region without any kind of restrictions. Verse 34. John.
The Amorites pressed the people of Dan back into the hill country, but they did not allow them to come down to the plain.
Abiding in the northern portion of the soon-to-be Philistine coastal plain in the valley of Ayalon, back near Judah, Dan was pushed up from the Shephelah, from the coast, 2,500 feet in elevation to the high hill country by the Amorites, which some have suggested, like we commented before, means the Westerners. Verse 35. Ron.
But the Amorites would dwell in Mount Heres, in Ajalon, and in Shalom, at the hand of the house of Joseph of Baal, so that they became tributaries.
In occupation of the western portion of the lowlands of the Shephelah, through the plain of the craftsmen, or the plain of Ono, as in Nehemiah 6:2, to the port city par excellence of Jaffa. It was not successful of the tribe of Dan. Dan could not hang on to this allotment that you see right here on the picture. And the reason they could not hang on to this allotment is because they were stuck between a rock and a hard place. They're a mouse stuck between two cats, and there's no way that they're gonna survive. So they just gotta pack up, and then they just move up into the high hill country. Now, Mount Heres mentioned in this verse, it should probably be identified with the hilly slopes east of the valley of Ayalon, which is right here on the map. Okay? Right here on the map. One more verse in chapter 1, verse number 36.
The border of the Amorites ran from the ascent of Akrabbim, from Selah and upward.
Those Amorites who were not put under forced labor seemed to depart south and establish themselves and put down roots near Akrabbim. What's Akrabbim? Akrabbim means the ascent of the scorpion. So looking at a general description of what this region looks like in the Negev. The ascent of the scorpions, it's basically a route, a treacherous route, south of the Dead Sea, and it served as an important intra-regional route between Edom from the east and the Mediterranean Sea to the west. Now, since this ascent, this route connects Edom with Judah, it is possible that the rock mentioned here is Petra, or in Isaiah 16:1 called Selah. In Isaiah 16:1, he's probably talking about Petra, he just calls it Selah. The incomplete, here's the last statement of the chapter, the incomplete conquest of Israel, and political chaos in Canaan provide the framework or the lens to understand the remainder of the book. So here's, by the way, you'll do fine on the test, don't worry. Okay, you'll do fine. Here's a test question, okay? What does, summarize chapter 1 of the book of Judges, summarize it. You would say that the incomplete conquest of Israel and the political chaos in the land of Canaan in chapter 1 provide the lens to understand or to read the remainder of the book through. All right. Nice scene. Let's take a 9-minute break.